What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Be the Number. I am your host, Spencer Aguiar, and I'm excited to have on one of my good friends, Sia Najad. Sia is the director of golf over at Win Daily Sports, and you can find him weekly on various podcasts, including the live show that the two of us do together with last week's guest, Joel Schreck. That can be seen live every Tuesday at 5 o'clock Pacific time, or you can catch the episodes on repeat if you check out the Win Daily YouTube channel or Win Daily Sports Show inside of Apple Podcasts. Sia, how are you doing, my man?
Spencer, I'm doing well. I'm excited about the Zozo, and it's just been, Spencer, it's just been so busy with football season too. It's interesting managing football with golf, just as a viewer, forget about just somebody who handicaps. So it's definitely an exciting time.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure, on my end getting to talk to you also, because I think you are one of the best minds in DFS golf, DFS football, all things you do. But even before we did our show together, I always respected your work beyond just the information. It's extremely difficult to find someone in this industry that is as smooth and comfortable on camera as you are. That's something I've always tried to emulate and learn from when we have worked together. But I wanted to tell you that because I don't think enough people give you credit for that inside of this industry.
Oh, I totally appreciate that. My background sort of lends itself to, talking to people and just being just generally kind of like sociable. So I'm not always, truth is I'm not always comfortable on camera, but it's really about what you project, not what you're feeling inside necessarily. But nobody's ever said that to me, honestly. So I definitely appreciate the compliment.
Of course. It's something that I think more people should know about you with it. It's the one thing that always caught me when we started working together is just how comfortable you were. And that actually leads me to my next question I had. And you kind of brought it up a little bit, but as I've gotten to know you a little bit better, I know that you are a licensed attorney now. I don't know if you were in front of courts giving depositions or you were behind the scenes, but I've always figured some of that with your comfortability and ease stem from that profession. You can tell me if I'm wrong with that, but explain to everyone a little bit about that part of your career and elaborate some, if you can, on how you got started in DFS golf.
Yeah, I was a trial attorney for 13 years. I'm still active in Virginia and in Florida. But to your question, I'm ballparking it between 500 and 600 depositions. So I'm very sort of comfortable with just sort of the questioning and things of that nature. I'm very meticulous when it comes to stuff like that. I've probably tried somewhere between 30 and 40 cases, some seven-figure cases. And I was a defense attorney for a trial attorney, if you will. So that's sort of like really bled into this industry a little bit. As far as DFS golf in particular, I've been handicapping, or I guess gambling, for like a better part of like 20 years. And golf and football were always like two of the things I was just generally better at than the other sports. I got into DFS really a long time ago, but I had a couple hits early in my sort of like DraftKings career where I'd finished first place in these 50,000 person, tournaments. And there's a lot of that, as Spencer, is luck. In terms of you got a $5 entry and it returns 5,000 because you finished first out of like 56,000 or whatever it was. There's some luck involved there, but I started to kind of get into a groove from a betting and DFS standpoint. And the short of it is just through meeting people and just, making relationships and getting feedback from people, like I'm getting feedback from you in terms of just kind of being a nice guy and, whatever, and a reasonably smart mind in the industry. A guy named David Jones, who is now at FTN, got me in touch with Jason Mizrahi, who's at Win Daily Sports. Of course, he's the president, CEO, whatever it is. And Jason brought me on board. So I do their golf content. I dabble in the football for Win Daily Sports too, but I also do that with CBS, CBS Sports, as you know. But yeah, that's how it started. Really, it was two-pronged. It was just kind of having some relationships that existed with people that were in this space that you're in right now, and then having some success in both the DFS and the betting world. And then boom, here I am talking to you.
Yeah, I've told this story before on different podcasts, but I think it's the story that a lot of us have that are not like, you have some people in this industry that are golfers. They played in high school, they played in college. You have other people, like my background is I'm a bettor. I take everything from a mathematical perspective with it. And football, basketball, those were the two sports that I originally got into this industry to do. And just the more I got into golf and the more that I started, finding that this is a really good sport that you can break down from a mathematical perspective, I started doing that, and it's grown to be my favorite sport to do. And as you know, Sia, Like, I didn't do NFL this year. This was the first year that I didn't run any of my projections. I don't have any fantasy football projections. I didn't run my mathematical projections for betting with it. So, I really like this golf industry. I think there's a lot of good, smart people in it. And I think the industry keeps growing. And, what we have going at Win Daily Sports between the two of us, Joel, I mean, we have a pretty broad team. Stick Picks, I do the Better Golf Pod show with him. We have a really good group. So it's just, it's something we're going to keep trying to grow. And it's always a pleasure having you and people like with your type of mindset to come onto this show. But before we do move into the Zozo Championship, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Rory McIlroy's victory at the CJ Cup. From a DFS point of view, he was one of my favorite plays because of how under the radar he was entering the week. And I think it's important for everyone listening to realize that recency bias shouldn't be the reason you make a decision for or against a player. That goes for placing a wager also, but my data ranked Rory as the second best golfer for the event, including being number one total driver in my recalculated model to fit the Summit Club. Always do your due diligence with it before you cross somebody out. But, just a couple thoughts on your NCA from the tournament last week.
Yeah, it's so funny because I really wish I had listened to you. You posted the clip yesterday and you couldn't have spelled it out any clearer. And that's one thing I think you do on this show and that we do on the Win Daily Sports show. We're pretty clear with who we like and who we don't like. And we do a really good job, in my opinion, obviously it's subjective, in sort of spelling out why we like a certain person. So you either like our rationale or you don't. But your rationale, as far as Rory was concerned, was really great. And honestly, I didn't have a ton of lineups last week, and I only had a couple outrights. It was Victor Hovland, and I'm trying to remember who the other outright I had was. But the point is, man, I wish I had listened to you because my DFS lineups would have been a lot better. And it's interesting because we have another no-cut event this week, and it's a relatively new course, of course, only played on once before, if memory serves. So I'm really, Spencer, to be honest, I'm really interested in what you have to say, like on this tournament, on the Zozo, because I think your insight, especially on courses where there's not much familiarity, just industry wide. I think because of your model and because of how specific the parameters are with your model and how you adjust them, I think it has even more value than it already does at tournaments like this, where there's just not a lot of information.
Yeah, it's interesting. So for me, the less data we have, the more I complicate a model. I did it last week for the CJ Cup, as you mentioned, but this week's about as convoluted as ever for the Zozo. So I will let you start with your breakdown in this, and then I will get into some of my stuff. So we have Narashino Country Club, 7,041 yards, par 70 bent grass greens. As you mentioned, another limited field of just 78 players. We do have some problems here. One of them, as you mentioned, we've only seen it one time in action during Tiger Woods' 2009 victory at 19 under par. The secondary problem we have is the venue doesn't have stat tracker present. That means some of the strokes gain data will have to be more of a guess than a definitive answer. But what did you see when you looked at the course?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like okay, so first of all, it's not a particularly long track. It's tree lined. The fairways are relatively narrow, but you don't get into a lot of trouble getting into the rough here. So you'd have to be really wayward to, put yourself maybe in the trees or something like that. One thing that I think is interesting, at least when it comes to just the non-penal nature of the rough, is that hitting fairways, the percentage is pretty low. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. It's certainly lower than tour average. But then when you get to greens in regulation, of course, it's right about tour average, which tells me that it's really, you can be wayward off the tee. I think distance sort of matters here. I'm curious what you have to say about that. But I also think this is more of a ball striker's haven. I think it's a second shot golf course, which a lot of golf courses are. I think around the green game is definitely going to come into play here. I'm really interested to hear what you say about the putting, because I have this like weird theory that bad putters might be good here. But again, it's really just a working theory. And frankly, it might not work. Other than that, I mean, we have 5 par 3s. I think we only have 3 par 5s. So par 3 scoring, par 4 scoring, of course, I've sort of not de-emphasized, but I don't have as much of an emphasis on par 5 scoring or strokes gained par 5. And then, of course, I'm going to look at, birdie or better gain and these guys that can score some points on courses like this.
Yeah, I agree with most of what you said with this. And I think part of the reason why the putting probably, if you can find bad putters here, these greens are so pure. Like, they're not typical bent grass greens for what you get. Like, these are going to roll very pure with it. And, we've seen it on the leaderboard in 2019. the players that were the ones that competed were not really typically your good putters in these events. So I do think that some of these guys like Emiliano Grillo, Keegan Bradley at least have a better chance here of competing than a normal tour stop. But just to get back to a little bit of what I was saying beforehand with why I complicate my model more for these types of tournaments, is because I'm trying to separate my research to be as unique as possible. It's challenging to find a super contrarian outlook when most of the knowns are going to be similar for all. But I can tinker with the data to fit a more precise viewpoint that will separate me from the pack. I don't want to overcomplicate this explanation I'm about to give. So let me just touch on the venue as a whole, and I'll give a more subdued breakdown of what I attached a weight to in my research. But Narashino Country Club is about an hour's drive east of Tokyo, Japan. It was originally built in 1976, and it features what I would call a claustrophobic design. And see, like the one thing that you said is, I agree, you have to be very wayward to miss, but it is a tree line property. And if you get stuck in the trees, all of a sudden everything changes from that. So fairways are of average width. The venue as a whole emphasizes a substantial tree line nature, as I just said. You're going to have to move the ball in multiple directions because of the dog legs throughout the 18 holes. To me, that means accuracy takes the podium over distance this week. I know that a lot of the guys that we saw find success were some of your long hitters, but they were guys that did everything. And I think that accuracy is a little bit more important this week than a lot of people believe it to be. We see that a little bit with the property measuring under 7,100 yards. I do want to note that that distance isn't completely irrelevant if you want to get more enhanced with your research, but I did gear mine towards accuracy when making a build. As you mentioned, we have a unique amount of par threes. All 5 measure below 200 yards, with 4 coming between 167 to 191. The easiest of the 5 is the 13th, which yields nearly a 20% birdie or better percentage and plays at 141 yards. The 3 par 5s are lengthy and all exceed 560 yards. The 14th is 608 yards and has only a 25.2 birdie or better rate. That number is greatly reduced for what we typically see on tour. And then we have the 10 par 4s that are all over the map in design. 4 are essentially super short at 360 to 400 yards. And we have 5 that are very long, between 480 to 500. For research purposes, I rounded up or down on the ones within a few yards because they still fit the purpose of what I'm trying to explain here. But we get 2 separate builds on these par 4s. One should be trying to find birdie makers at the shorter holes. And the second is golfers that will avoid bogeys, since all 5 of those longer par 4s carry over a 20% bogey rate. The only other notable point that you're going to hear throughout the industry a lot this week is Japan has a different construction where they have 2 greens per hole. They do this for during the summer and one during the winter, just to keep them fresh, but it's something golfers will need to be aware of for the week. So I started with a weighted par 4 that is built towards Narashino Country Club for 20%. That's going to include a combination of those key distances that I mentioned. It also will have a varying amount of birdie or better mixed with bogey avoidance. The top 5 of that model was Colin Morikawa, Joaquin Neiman, Siwoo Kim, Pat Perez, and Xander Schauffele. Weighted par 3 for 10%. As both of us have mentioned, we have 1 more than usual, and 4 of the 5 are gettable. That stat is derived from par 3 average and then some of the key proximity ranges where the holes are set up. Weighted par 5 for 10%. Overall birdie or better on par 5s, some long iron play, and how golfers perform on longer par 5s got weighted together to come up with a mathematical number there. I did a weighted bentgrass category for 10%. That was 70% strokes gained total at bentgrass properties and 30% strokes gained putting on bentgrass. I like the combination because it added in some putting, but still kept the premier course fits up top. 15% weighted proximity. I agree with you, Sia. I believe this is a second shot course. I really like the ball strikers here. So for the most part, that's just removing proximity from over 200 yards and recalculating the model to try and mimic some semblance of the venue this week. The percentages won't be perfect because we don't have data at hand, but I still think it works better removing the less critical elements from the equation. Strokes gained total on short par 70s over the last 50 rounds for 10%. This specific layout, is very easily quantifiable under the metrics you look at. Whether you use a site like Fantasy National or do it by hand, you can look at short par 70s and come up with that. It doesn't mean all players that have struggled at a shorter test will do so again, but it's nice to have an idea of who is more likely to pop from off the pace. Weighted driving for 15%. I used a combination of driving accuracy and fairways gained. And then sand safe percentage for 10%. There are a lot of bunkers that surround greens. Being able to get up and down should help salvage scores. So that's how I'm building my model this week. I don't know if you have anything you want to add to that, Sia.
No, I mean, I think as far as the metrics that I was focusing on, they're certainly all encompassed in your. Let me share with you though, and this again, my working theory on the putting, because I think one thing that I know about these courses in Japan, or maybe all of Asia, but I know in Japan, the greens are very. You might have mentioned the word pure, but just meticulously taken care of, and I wonder because of that, does it take away some of the variables, some of the issues that a bad putter might have? I mean, obviously you might just hit it bad. That's why you're a bad putter. But I think a lot of it is maybe a mental game and, reading it correctly or factoring in the read while trying to hit it well. I wonder if some of these bad putters would be better on this type of surface versus one that isn't perhaps manicured or looked after the way some of the courses on the PGA Tour are. And I'm not saying they're not looked at. I'm just saying the greens themselves, I think, are a little bit smoother. Do you think that helps or hurts a bad putter?
I would think it has to help a bad putter with it. I'm kind of in the same mindset that you are. I think when you get these courses where there's a lot of tricky reads and a lot of things that can go wrong, these good putters can separate themselves from the pack a little bit more. When you get these pure surfaces and these well manicured greens and these guys are striking the ball better than a lot of these other guys. I mean, there's a reason why Hideki Matsuyama, Emiliano Grillo, Keegan Bradley, these guys are always on the top of the list on these ball striking metrics, and then they never make a putt. If you can put them close and you put them within the vicinity of trying to make something, and it's going to be an easier read for them, I think it can only help them. And I think that makes everybody more in play. Now, I will say there are players I like here that are also really good putters. And we'll talk about some of those guys in a second, I guess. But, I'm just looking for good ball strikers. I'm trying to find people where my model likes them a little bit more, but I'm willing to not discredit some of these guys that do struggle with the putter. But I guess let's move into this opening group here, which is led by Colin Morikawa at 11,200. We have Xander Schauffele as the second choice at 11,000. Will Zalatoris at 10,500. Hideki Matsuyama at 10,300. And Tommy Fleetwood rounds out the five names there above $10,000. We are extremely early in the week still, and ownership will shift for the next few days. But Sia, thoughts on this range in general?
Well, my first thought is Tommy Fleetwood. What are you doing here? Like, what is happening? Why is Fleetwood?
I'll have a take for this. I will have a take for this.
I cannot wait. So there's two guys I really like, and then there's the other two that I think will be less rostered, and maybe you can pepper in there. But my favorite by far is Colin Morikawa. I really like how I think he was dealing with an injury, particularly during the FedEx Cup playoffs, maybe before the FedEx Cup playoffs as well a little bit, and his play was very shaky, miscut at the Northern Trust, 63rd at the BMW, 26th at the Tour Championship. And man, that's scary. Do you play him at the CJ Cup or do you not play him at the CJ? And then boom, he's, second place. It was a home event for him if you wanted to ride that narrative. A lot of people were on him for good reason. Well, I think it's an even better reason to be on him this week. I think if you're looking at ball striking, if you're looking at an approach course or a second shot course, I think Colin Morikawa is going to be right at home here. So I like him quite a bit. I think there's some narrative stuff with Xander as well. Obviously, has a lot of ties to Japan, plays well in Japan, all that stuff. I think Xander's a fine play. But generally speaking, I think you're only probably going to play one guy up here if you're playing any of them, which I think at this tournament, you're probably playing at least one. For me, it's going to be Colin. I think Decky is interesting. I don't really love how he's been finishing tournaments over the last, 2-3 months outside of a couple really nice finishes. I don't want to say he's overpriced, but when I measure him against a Colin Morikawa or a Xander Schauffele, it just doesn't really add up for me. So if I'm doing, let's say 10 or 15 lineups, yeah, he's in one or two, but he's not in my main single entry, for example. Zalatoris, I think, is probably going to carry the lowest ownership other than Tommy Fleetwood. And I think he's really interesting. I mean, he miscut at Shriners. That's not great. And his play has been a little erratic, especially with the putter. But with that said, I think he's an okay play. But again, I'm not playing him because it's going to be probably the chalky Colin Morikawa or the kind of chalky Xander Schauffele for me.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem of what you just mentioned there is, unfortunately, pricing is really good. And maybe that has more to do with the fact that the field is watered down at the very bottom. But if I'm being honest, I don't like this tournament from a DraftKings perspective. You
Mhm.
get these weird built in scenarios where you have two golfers, as you mentioned, in Shoffley and Morikawa. There's sub 8-1 to win the event. And I don't want to say you have to at least consider fading them in large field GPPs if they reach 30+%, because the problem is that you're going to be stuck with it. Like it's a weird scenario that you're in this week. They're almost warranted to be 30% for the reason you just mentioned with it. Like they are the cream of the crop. Like they are the two best players in this field. And I have a hard time seeing how they don't at least stay competitive. So we run into this weird quandary of trying to figure out what makes sense. If we fade them completely and one of them wins, it's going to turn into a wipeout of a week. If we use one and he wins, we're still not guaranteed to be profitable. I just hate these tournaments where the chalk is the chalk for the right reasons. And
Mhm.
we're put into these decision-making spots where we're, fading mostly because of ownership if we do. So for that reason, I'm not going to tell anybody to fade Morikawa. I'm not going to tell anybody to fade Xander. I think they are the two most popular players for a reason. Um, but I will say this now. This is where the contrarian, if you listen to a show from me, you're always going to get these outside of the box narratives where I'm the only person that's on these things. But Tommy Fleetwood is probably my favorite pivot if his ownership stays sub 10%. It doesn't quite equal what I said with Rory last week because I don't think Tommy is as good of a ball striker as he was a few years ago. But I want to go into that deeper when looking at this course. So Fleetwood is 37th for me out of 78 players when it comes to strokes gain approach. That's not good for the fifth price golfer in an event where I believe the course is a second shot venue. But when I condense the proximity numbers to equal more of what he should get this weekend at Narashino, he grades eighth in this field. We can say he is overpriced at $10,000, but I truly believe it's marginal at best if everyone wants to look elsewhere. So for me, decisions are going to have to be made on Morikawa and Xander. I'm going to sprinkle them into lineups. I'm not going to talk anybody out of them because the math does check out. Fleetwood is going to fit heavily into my core. And everybody else, I'm going to kind of just try to beat for the reasons that you mentioned with it. Like, I just like Morikawa and Xander so much more. I don't think you have such a discount in price or such a discount in ownership when it comes to Zalatoris or Hideki that really makes sense to pivoting in that direction. Like Fleetwood is the one guy that it does make sense to do it if you want to go that route. But those are the three that I will find myself having the most exposure to. But let's move into this $9,000 range and get some of your thoughts as a whole on this
It's
range.
fun. Yeah, it's funny because the 9K range is typically, if I don't like the 10K range or the elite range, sometimes it gets into the 11K. I will always say, well, oh, I love this 9K range. Because like last week, for example, what was it? Hovland and Louis were all in the 9K range. I love starting builds in the 9K range because I think the margins between, a 9,800 guy and a 10,600 guy are kind of minimal. But here, to your point, I mean, these are pretty big differences between like Colin Morikawa, Xander Schauffele, and like Alex Noren and Maverick McNeely. I mean, no disrespect to those guys. I played them both last week. I like them both, but it's just, wow, Emiliano Grillo, another guy I like this week, but it's just that the differences are stark. So, I'm going to have to play some Fleetwood because you just told me to. And because, again, from a game theory standpoint, it makes sense. And honestly, sometimes when these prices jump out at me and I'm like, whoa, like this makes no sense. Part of me is also like, okay, DraftKings is telling me something too, or maybe the betting market in certain cases is telling me something. Maybe I should take heed to this like crazy price. But in this 9K range, I go all the way down to Keegan Bradley. EVR is interesting to me, but Keegan Bradley, again, I'm looking at ball striking here. And Keegan Bradley, he just checks so many boxes. Par 4 scoring around the green is pretty good. Strokes gained par 3, good drives. I mean, he just sort of checks all the boxes. He's Keegan Bradley, so the win equity seems low. But again, in this field, you just need 3 or 4 guys at the top to stumble. And all of a sudden, guys like Keegan Bradley will just by default be at the top. I mean, again, there's only so many people, these moderate golfers, at least, I say moderate, these average golfers relative to the Colin Morikawa. There's only so many people that they need to pass in this particular field. So I like Keegan. Tringali's interesting to me. I'm kind of on the fence. You could feel free to convince me there. And Grio's another guy that And it's why I brought up the putting thing, because he can be pretty bad with the putter, including last week where he lost, I believe, a stroke and a half with the putter, but he gained everywhere else. And by the way, him losing a stroke and a half with the putter really isn't that big a deal. That's pretty good for Emiliano Grillo. So if you're gaining around the green and you're gaining on approach and you're gaining off the tee and you're losing a stroke or two with the putter, well, you're probably going to finish pretty high. But if my theory somehow ends up being true that even a guy like Grillo might be able to putt pretty well on these greens, well, then maybe he's not losing a stroke and a half. Maybe he's gaining a quarter of a stroke, or maybe he's an even putter. And then now you're talking about a guy in this field that could be in the top 5 with down the stretch of the tournament. So it's Keegan for me, ball striker, Emiliano Grillo for me, ball striker. And 2 guys I think I would consider are probably, I would say, EVR and Cameron Tringale. I don't think I'm going to be paying up for Ricky Fowler or Joaquin Niemann, but I have a feeling you're going to like Joaquin Niemann.
I always like Joaquin Niemann, and that's a pretty good segue for me to talk about the top 5 of my model here. So if I backtrack a little bit, number 1 was Colin Morikawa, number 2 was Xander Schauffele, number 3, Joaquin Niemann, number 4, Hideki Matsuyama, number 5, Tommy Fleetwood. So Fleetwood fits into that mix right behind there, which, if we're just going based off of math here, he's the 5th most expensive player. My model has him the 5th most expensive player, or should be the 5th most expensive player. And if nobody's going to play him, that's where I'm trying to leverage ownership with it. But yeah, as far as Joaquin Niemann goes, he was the very first ticket that I punched before Paul Casey removed himself from the field at 28-1. Niemann has gone ice cold with the putter recently, which was amplified by losing 4.5 last weekend at the CJ Cup. But my viewpoint has remained the same from him over the last few months. He's gained with his irons in 14 of 16, off the tee in 11 of 13. And we aren't talking about massive numbers during most of those, but I doubt the ownership will get high enough for me to pivot elsewhere. In reality, I could start a lineup with him. I could put him behind Fleetwood as my second man. That alone would diversify any build for me. And as far as the rest of this group goes, I don't want to spend too much time talking about them. Almost all are playable for me, even if they aren't the first go-to choice. We will see where the ownership ends up going, but I like Eric Van Rooyen at 9,500. As you mentioned, Keegan Bradley's an intriguing GPP target. Maverick McNeely's probably more playable for cash at 9,300. Cameron Tringale's worth a look in all builds. My model prefers him for cash, but if he's going to be sub 5%, that puts him in play across the board. I like Emiliano Grillo for all the reasons you just mentioned. It's just an accurately priced range where we're seeing massive leverage spots open up because of everybody that's being played at the top. I view everyone pretty similar in that sense. The 2 that I'm least intrigued with would be Siwoo Kim and Ricky Fowler compared to the rest. But the whole group ranges between 7th and 20th for the most part in my model. That's probably the shortest breakdown I've ever given on this show before about a tier. But just know everyone is usable. Sometimes the answer doesn't need to be extremely long when nobody separates themselves from the pack. If you like any of the names listed, I definitely am not going to talk you off being overweight on them. But let me move us into the 8,000s here this time. And I will begin this with a cash game take. So Jonathan Vegas, 8,900. CT Pan 8,800 and KH Lee 8,700 are all very much in play for me in cash. I think you can rotate the group into GPPs also, although the best value for them is coming from their cash safety. Each ranks inside the top 8 for me in that sort of a build. But my 2 favorite GPP plays that are creating the best leverage, and I think at some point we're going to need that leverage. If we're going to play Xander and we are going to play some of these popular plays, Fleetwood's one way to do it, but we are going to need to create leverage somewhere so we don't just have duplicated builds. But my 2 favorites would be Ryan Palmer at 8,300 and Chris Kirk at 8,100. So Palmer's form looks shaky with multiple missed cuts at his last handful of showings, but I'm willing to ignore most of that because of how he fits for the course. He ranks 10th in this field over the past 50 rounds on short par 70 layouts. He's second when playing short par 4s, which will be needed to be scored at to compete. And he's also inside the top 20 for weighted proximity, putting from 5 to 10 feet and overall birdie or better percentage. As for Kirk, I believe the stats are better than his form would indicate. And it's the same thought process I just mentioned with Palmer, how the shorter makeup lends for more upside. Kirk has gained with his irons in 8 of 9 starts, off the tee in 4 of 7. But this is the kind of venue you would anticipate seeing him find success because of his accuracy off the tee. He ranks 10th in my reweighted proximity category and is also inside the top 15 for GIR, 3-putt percentage, sand safe percentage, overall bogey avoidance, scrambling, par 4 average. I mean, the list just goes on and on with him. So Kirk is the biggest disparity in my model when it comes to my rank versus his price tag of anyone we have talked about so far. I will find myself using him in builds in all kinds of game types just because of how easy he is. But that's where I'm at in this range. Sia, what are you seeing?
That's really interesting on Kirk because I already built a couple lineups. In the first one, I had to just I basically it was one of those situations where I had 8,100 left, and I was kind of, or maybe it was 8,400, whatever it was. I was in this sort of range, and I ended up landing on Kirk, and I was just, it was just one of those things. So, and I was comfortable with it. So I really like the analysis on Kirk. The Ryan Palmer analysis is so interesting to me because I kind of don't know where his game went, but given what you're telling me on like kind of the shorter courses and the weighted proximities and things of that nature, he's really intriguing because people are going to look what he's done the last, I don't know, 3 to 6 months, and it's pretty horrific. But we know Ryan Palmer has the upside and just the sheer talent to be a good golfer, especially in a field like this and on a course like this. So you've definitely sold me on Ryan Palmer. I am the self-proclaimed president of the Ryan Palmer fan club, so it's an easy sell to me. KH Lee is another guy that I think is going to be under-owned that I think is a really good play here. Jonathan Vegas is kind of an obvious play. The ball striking is there. I mean, we know how good he is off the tee, but the approach game and the all-around game has really been there. So in this field, believe it or not, I think Jonathan Vegas at 8,900 is a nice value. Hoffman is a guy that I just generally like, and I know he's a good ball striker, and I know he has potential. When I look at this field, even though I know he doesn't really have much upside, again, when I look at this field, I feel like he could potentially contend here, but he's been pretty middling lately. Off the tee, he hasn't been very good, but he's another guy I'm going to play just because, again, I'm looking for ball strikers, and I know, you go back, Spencer, to the middle of last year, and the guys that were striking the ball the best were Charlie Hoffman and Keegan Bradley. Any sort of like recent type of model, like last 36 rounds, you run it in May, you ran it in June, you ran it in July. Those guys were showing up. So I know they're not too far removed from just being really great strategic players who get it in the fairway and are great on approach as well. So it's Charlie, but my favorite are probably Jonathan Vegas, Charlie Hoffman, and probably KH Lee. And then after that, you've sold me on a couple of shares of Palmer, and I do like Chris Kirk as well. So that's where I'm going in this 8K range.
Yeah, and I'm not going to try to talk you out of anybody there. I kind of really like with where your head's at there too. Like if we just look at who are the positive values in this range, or at least break even values, it's Vegas, it's CT Pan, it's KH Lee, it's Charlie Hoffman, Ryan Palmer, and Chris Kirk. So there's not a ton of people. I mean, I think we touched on everybody in that range. I mean, I guess Pan would be the one that's worth discussing a little bit, just because I do think he is such a great cash game play, and his ownership right now is looking like it's going to be very chalky. Maybe he just makes more sense to plug into cash for that reason. I'm never a CT Pan guy, so for him to be 8th in my model for safety, I thought that was at least something worth looking into a little bit deeper with it. But that top group of it, like Vegas, Pan, KH, Leah, I'm definitely fine sprinkling them into GPP builds. I don't think anything's wrong with that. But let's move into the $7,000 section. We have an extremely limited group here. Early ownership seems to have flocked to the same players, but let me give you the golfers that are positive values on my spreadsheet compared to just their DFS price. Then I'll kick it over to you to hear your thoughts. And not everyone listed should technically be a play, but I'll go from the biggest difference to the smallest. So Tom Hoagie, 7,000, Doug Gim, 7,000, Brendan Todd, 7,400, Pat Perez, 7,300, your boy Harry Higgs at 7,500, Brendan Steele, 7,100. Henrik Norlander, 7,400. Matt Jones, 7,200. And then technically Sebastian Munoz at 7,300. That's 9 of the 15 players that are showing as a positive value for me. That's a very large percentage to fall under that tab. We do lose a handful of those names when comparing my overall rank versus just their ownership percentage. But Sia, did I mention anyone that you liked from that group?
Yeah, a few guys. I'll start from the most expensive one because I don't really like any of the guys in the upper 7K range. I mean, Robert Strub is interesting. It's not just last tournament. He's been pretty good over the last 5 or 6, but I'm not playing him. Let's put it that way. Harry Higgs, I never really play, but he is a pretty good course fit here. I mean, I love his approach game. Henrik Norlander is probably one of my favorite values. We know he can pop on approach, strokes gained Most of the par four parameters, par five, he rates out great. He has one missed cut since the Palmetto. And in that time, he's got two top fives as well. So I think the upside is there. I think 7,400 is a great value. I've already decided that I'm going to have him as a first round leader play at 55 to 1. So for those of you listening that watch the Win Daily Sports PGA show tomorrow with Spencer and Joel Schreck, we'll be giving out first round leader plays and outright plays. And he's definitely going to be one of the first round leader plays. Outside of that, Takumi Kanaya is interesting to me. We know he was the top amateur a couple of years ago. He's Japanese. That doesn't mean it's a home game. It's a big country, but you know, I definitely think he's going to be a little bit more comfortable here on this particular course than some of the other guys. I think it's one of those guys where he's not really going to show up in any models. You just have to have a little bit of faith there. I'll probably pepper him into a couple of lineups. The other two guys I really like, you mentioned, it's Doug Gim, and Doug Gim is purely because of thinking and assuming that bad putters might do well. Although I will say his approach game has been a little shaky lately. It hasn't been the classic Doug Gim, but I'm willing to forgive that for this tournament and hope he does well. But I like Tom Hoge a little bit better than Doug Gim. So I think I'm going to be playing a decent amount of Tom Hoge, another guy that can pop on approach and just pops in tournaments here and there that he's been pretty good. I mean, if you just look at his recent form, 32nd, 14th, miscut, 36th, 49th, 4th. Those were in much better fields than what he's in now. And again, he can be really hot on approach. So he's a guy that I like.
Yeah, and let me backtrack a little bit to what you just said with Takumi Kanaya, because I think it's an interesting point that you brought up with him, because he is not going to pop on a model. You're not going to see him. I mean, he's not popping in my model, but look at Vegas pricing sometimes when you want to do these things. Look at head-to-head matchups. See who he's priced against. Find who these guys are, and you'll start realizing that Vegas likes them more than the general public perception does. So even if we just look at Kanaya here, let's start at the $7,200 golfers. He's 66 to 1 to win the tournament. Matt Jones, 90 to 1. Brendan Steele, 100 to 1. Sepp Straka, 160 to 1. That's just down to $7,100 right there. So you can kind of see that Vegas believes Kanaya has a chance here. I like where your head's at there. I joke about Harry Higgs to anybody who doesn't know the joke. I've learned recently that Sia does not ever play Harry Higgs. So, take that for what it's worth with it. But my number one contrarian target on the board, and this is for any price range, is Brendan Todd. And it isn't even particularly close. I guess if you're trying to find somebody else that's off by at least 10 spots, it would be Brendan Steele. But Todd, from a GPP standpoint, I have him 46 spots off in just a 78-man field, and that's looking at ownership versus my rank. I love how he's played in his career on similar par fours as the ones he has in front of him in Japan. He's my number one driver and number one putter. Now, I agree with you, Sia, that maybe if the putting gets neutralized a little bit, you can make an argument, but is there the opposite effect here that Brendan Todd just makes everything because they're so easy? And I think maybe I'd rather look at the guys that are either really good or really bad and kind of go that route with it. But, the thing I really like about Todd is he at least can get hot with his irons. He's been rotating between earning and losing with his approach game over the last few months. He's gained 2.6 at the Fortinet, 4.6 at the Wyndham. Those are also courses that benefit finding the fairway. He's projected 1.5% right now. So for GPPs, I'm all in on him. And then the other one I'll mention outside of Steele and Todd would be Pat Perez. I like Doug Gim also. I'd like to see where his ownership goes, because Sia is right that his irons have been trending in the wrong direction. And the same with Perez. I'd like to see where his ownership goes too. But if you recall, Perez withdrew from the Shriners on the final hole of the day on Friday after already being guaranteed to miss the cut. That's not an injury problem. That's probably more so him wanting to go to the Vegas Strip to get a, drink situation than anything else. So I don't want to people to look at that Perez withdrawal and say, okay, all of a sudden that guy, withdrew from a tournament. He's not in play. But I think all the names that I mentioned as values are worth digging into a little bit deeper. I really like the Kanaya play from Sia for what he just said. But, you can use my model that I release on Twitter to get the full picture of some of the players I like in these last two sections. But I will rapid fire off some choices here in the 6,000s that I'm going to give a deeper dive to before lock. A lot of these decisions will be made because of ownership. But Doc Redman, 6,800. Roger Sloan, 6,800. Andrew Putnam, 6,700. My guy Stick picks his boy Chan Kim, and that actually is his boy. That one is not tongue in cheek with that at 6,500. And the three total dart throws would be James Hahn, 6,300. Kyle Stanley, 6,200, and Wesley Bryan at the stone minimum price of 6,000. If ownership remains on the upward trajectory for Stanley, I don't mind getting off of him, but we're going to have to pick and choose spots in a condensed field. I'm going to be very heavy on Brendan Todd, Chris Kirk, and choices like that, but I'm still whittling down my core as of our record on Monday night, just like everyone else. But that will be my breakdown of the board through all these sections. What do you like in this final range, Sia?
It's funny you brought up Stanley and Wesley Bryan, because I was on a show earlier today, and those were the first two guys I brought up, like not only on the 6K range, but in the entire show, like almost as a joke, but really actually as a thing that I'm going to play. I mean, Kyle Stanley, if you look at his splits from short game to ball striking, it is, no pun intended, it's striking. I mean, it truly is unbelievable what you see, how bad he is with the short game, and how I think it was probably last 50 rounds. He is 7th in this field ball striking. I mean, that is really telling you something about how elite this guy is. So the only way you get away with playing him is if he's somehow halfway decent with the putter and the around the green game. I'm willing to take that gamble in a no-cut event at 6,200. It just makes sense to me. This might be the place to actually play Kyle Stanley. I love Wes Bryan too. I mean, we know how good the approach game can be for him. Now, he is coming off an injury, and I think this is his first tournament since that injury. So that scares me just a little bit, but he's like the minimum price. So if he finds any sort of that approach game, you know, you're good to go. I prefer Stanley over Wes Bryan, but another guy that just entered the tournament, this is another puntish play. He's 6,000 flat, but it's Sean Norris. He came in when I think Paul Casey withdrew. Sean Norris has been pretty good, not only on the European tour, but also on the Japanese tour, where I think his main sort of tour that he plays. Sean Norris is pretty good, and he probably shouldn't be 6,000. So he's another guy that I'm going to consider. I don't really like anybody in the upper 6K range. If I was going to choose somebody, it would probably be Sam Ryder or Roger Sloan, maybe Doc Redman, but I'm just not really that interested. I may just deep dive into that Kyle Stanley, Wes Bryan, Sean Norris range when I have to dip into the 6K range. But believe me, you can make some pretty cool lineups if you take, you know, one or two of these guys down. It's not something I recommend, but if you took Kyle Stanley, I think that would be a decent gamble to take considering his ball striking.
Yeah, I think you can open things up down here, and just from a model differential standpoint, this is everybody who's in the tournament. Biggest difference is Kyle Stanley for me. Tom Hoge is second. Doug Gim, Wesley Bryan, Chris Kirk, Brendan Todd, Andrew Putnam. I mean, that's the top 6 or 7 in that range of people that are at least worth a shot at their price tag with it. I mean, I'm always going to be cognizant of what ownership's at, but I think you can go a lot of different routes this week for roster construction. I don't think you're stuck to a different thing, or you can be stuck to different things with it. I don't think you need to do the same thing that everybody else is doing. I think the worst thing you can do is make a lineup that's easily duped in the smaller field. So just be aware of who is going to be popular. If you're going to play a guy like Xander, just be aware of who you're going to plug him with. It doesn't, if you're in a single entry 3 max type build, you can be a little bit more aggressive with that ownership, or I guess less aggressive is what I'm trying to say. Like, you can be more aggressive by having more ownership. You can take more of that ownership and try to deviate from one spot. If you're in some of these larger fields, which we don't have very good tournaments on DraftKings. So that's not even, I mean, you are going to have some tournaments where you need to get a little bit tricky with, but the offseason has been disappointing, unfortunately, with their makeup of it. So, I mean, there's
Spencer,
that.
It wasn't this bad last football season. What was it on DraftKings with the tournament selection?
No,
Like,
it was,
what
I
are we
remember
doing
it
here?
being good. I don't know. I mean,
Right.
I will look at the PGA Tour. We can't even get golf on television until there's like 9 holes left. So
Yes.
it's across the board bad with it. Like, I'm sitting on my Rory ticket and I don't get to watch any of the golf until there's like, Rory had like 10 holes left, I believe, once they cut to him.
I'm actually, one thing we maybe should, we'll certainly get, we'll point it out tomorrow too, but you know, one thing that's different, because this is in Japan, of course, is that the start time is going to be vastly different. Do you happen to know when it starts? It's Wednesday night at some point.
I don't know when it is. It is Wednesday night at some point. If you follow Sia or you follow myself on Twitter, one of us will post a message about it. It's going to be, I don't want to give a time and confuse anybody on it, but it's going to be a little bit later. So just be aware of that.
They're 13 hours ahead. So, I mean, we're making assumptions here, but if we assume they start sometime, let's say 7 in the morning, obviously, you're looking at, I don't know. I don't know what you're looking at, but probably around like 6 or 7 at night on
Yeah.
Wednesday. So the point is make sure you have your lineups like in by like Wednesday morning, like lock them in, but then like you can make changes. Like I guess my point is at least have a lineup in there Wednesday morning, and then you can tweak it once you kind of realize, because I think a lot of people they're on autopilot with this stuff and they forget, and then it's Wednesday at 10 o'clock and they have a dummy lineup in or something.
No, I completely agree with that. That's something that you need to be aware of out there. But before I let you get out of here, Sia, I want to play a game that you and Joel Shrek created, which is Good Chalk, Bad Chalk.
Love it.
For those that have never listened or didn't listen last week to this show, the premise of the game is simple. I'm going to read out some of the highest owned players on the board, and Sia and I will take turns saying if they are good chalk, meaning they are worth playing at their ownership, or bad chalk, being the opposite and players we might want to pivot off of in GPPs. I'll start with you, Sia, each time, and let's run through a handful of these. The ownership will probably change across the board by the time this airs, but I will mention what I have as of Monday night for reference sake. So top owned guy on the board, Colin Morikawa, 31%.
God, it's unbelievable. I hate to say it because I'd like to go the other way, but I'm going to say good chalk.
Here's my opinion, and I'm going to take the cop-out answer with this. I don't think you can eat both the Morikawa and Xander ownership. I think you have to make a decision.
Yeah.
I guess. Oh man, I don't know.
I actually agree with you. What is Xander's ownership looking like right now?
Xander, the number 2 guy on the board, 28%.
So it's so marginal. Yeah, because if it was a difference of like 5 or 6%, maybe I would just say Xander. As in Xander is the chalk I would eat, and Colin Morikawa is the bad chalk. So maybe we have to wait and see. But I agree with you. They can't both be good chalk, right?
No.
Right.
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I don't even know what kind of roster construction you could put together, because if you're going to play the two of them, then you kind of have to get down into that range where Kyle Stanley, I think he's a great play, but he's also like the most popular guy in the $6,000 section. So I think you start running into this weird thing where that is going to be a heavily duplicated lineup. So
you'll have to grab 2 6K guys if you do that. Because
yes.
I actually tried to do that. And in terms of rostering both, just to see how it would work. And you really got to go low.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I mean, I don't think both of them can be. I'm going to take the easy answer out of this. I'll probably take the one that is lesser owned. They're number 1 and 2 for me in my model. For the way that this is set up right now, I will say bad chalk for Colin Morikawa. I will say good chalk for Xander. What about you for Xander? I mean, I guess you have to go the opposite kind of.
I have to go the opposite. So I'm going to say bad chalk for Xander.
Jonathan Vegas. Now, once again, very early in the week, I'm seeing 26%. I assume that will fall. These numbers always fall as it goes on. I mean, 26 is, you can take for that what it's worth, but Jonathan Vegas, 26%.
Anything higher than 21%, and I'm going to say bad chalk.
I am also going to say bad chalk at that. I would probably be fine with him at 22, 23%. 26 is too high. We'll see where that goes. Henrik Norlander, 23%.
Wow, that's my guy. I have to say, this is just more of a gut thing for me. I mean, obviously the metrics are bearing out pretty well for him too, but I have to say good chalk, even though 7K chalk is almost always bad chalk. I'm going to say good chalk, regrettably.
I'm going to say bad. I like him as a value, and unfortunately, I agree with you on that. I think I would rather just use him for cash, though. Like, I'm not going to take him out of my player pool entirely. I do think he's a good play, but I'm going to say bad chalk for GPPs. And the one thing I will say to that is you can eat some of these. Like, not every single one can be a good chalk, but you can eat some of these. Like, you're okay playing some of these guys like Henrik Norlander if you like a guy or two in there, but it'll be bad chalk for me. KH Lee, 20%.
Oh, I like KH Lee, but that's bad chalk for me.
I'm going to say bad chalk at over 20%. If this dropped to 16, 17%, I'm more fine in that range. Tom Hoge, 19%.
What? I mean, I know this is a 78-person field, so these numbers are a little bit inflated. But yeah, I'm not playing Tom Hoge at close to 20%. No chance. 0% chance.
Bad chalk for me. If he's less than 15%, we'll rehab this conversation
Mhm.
and maybe he gets there eventually. Because the one thing I will say with my numbers, I don't think everybody can be this popular. I think somebody's going to have to drop at some point.
Yeah.
On Monday, you always get these fluky ownership percentages with it. But at the number currently, it's going to be bad chalk until he drops. Talk again at 15%.
Mhm.
CT Pan, 19%.
Bad chalk.
Yep, bad for me also on that. Adam Shank, which I don't have his number in front of me, but let's call it, I believe the rest of these three are 18%. So Adam Shank, 18%.
He's one of my guys. I really like him, but in spite of really, he's got a lot of really good finishes over the last 3, 4, 5 months. But it's bad chalk for me.
Bad chalk for me also. Will Zalatoris. Now, maybe you end up being right on Zalatoris because I kind of agree with you that not everybody can be that popular. Right now, my ownership is showing 17% for him. My theory on it is I would just rather play either Morikawa or Xander if he's at 17, but he'll be bad for me. What about you, Sia?
Yeah, he'll be bad for me, but I will say that if Colin and Xander end up being like right around 30% and Zalatoris is around 16, 15, maybe even 17%. I think that's a big enough gap for me to not take Colin out of my pool all of a sudden, but to play a few more shares of Will
Sure.
Zalatoris. So I think he's bad chalk for now. But if Colin and Xander keep rising, then I'm going to have some shares of Will Zalatoris for sure.
Yeah, when I look at my model just from a safety perspective, Zalatoris is third. So, I mean, that one's hard to argue against. And then I know your answer for this one. We'll both just give the answer because I know we're both on the same side. Ricky Fowler.
Bad chalk.
Yeah, I think that's very bad chalk. I don't think you get that. I mean, maybe Fowler does it again, but you shouldn't be getting this kind of a price correction. Like, I've been waiting for Jason Day to be like $10,000. And maybe at that point, like Jason Day is good chalk no matter where he is. But Ricky Fowler, I mean, like, it's just hard to find a reason for one tournament to get him up into that range. But that was something from me. I mean, I was a little bit of a Debbie Downer, I think, across the board. I think I had bad chalk for every single person. But Sia, how about you take us out of here on a more positive note? Tell everyone where they can find you on Twitter. And please talk a little about the NFL DFS show you do for CBS Sports and the Sirius Radio program you have with Jason Mizrahi of Win Daily.
Yeah, so you can find me at Sia Najad if you're watching this live as opposed to just listening. There's my handle right there at SIANEJAD. You can find me, I guess, in a lot of places now, especially during football season. CBS Sports has an NFL DFS show. They just started it this year. Me and Mike McClure do that with Frank Stanfield. We do that twice a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays. We also do DFS, of course, on the Saturday night show, Sirius XM Fantasy Sports Radio. I do that with Jason Mizrahi. And then, of course, we have the Win Daily Sports Show, Spencer, which you do with me and Joel Schreck. So you can find me there. And obviously, Win Daily Sports does a lot of football DFS as well. So Win Daily Sports, CBS, you'll be able to find me at both of those places, and Nick Bretwish, Sticks Picks, and a bunch of other great people. And Spencer, by the way, for those of you that don't know, he's in our Discord. He's part of our golf team as well, writes articles for us as well, and they're top notch, as you would imagine. So definitely duck into there and check out the work of Tee Off Sports.
No, I appreciate that, Sia, and I can't stress enough to everyone listening. Be sure to give Sia a follow. Like, you are blowing up in this industry, and we've had discussions off the air, and obviously you're doing great work with NFL. You're doing the great work that we do with golf together with it. But I think you're going to see Sia across the board in a lot of these sports, and he's going to be more and more prevalent and relevant on the screen of what you're watching. So once again, that is at Sia Najad on Twitter. You can follow me on Instagram or Twitter at Tee Off Sports. Thank you once again for joining me for the Zozo Championship. Good luck this week to anyone gambling on the event, and let's continue to make that money. Thanks, guys.